There comes a moment in every person's journey toward self-mastery when they look around and realize they no longer belong where they once felt at home. The conversations that used to engage you now feel hollow. The people who used to inspire you now seem small. The environments that used to comfort you now feel suffocating. This is not arrogance. This is not superiority. This is growth recognizing itself, and growth is always lonely at first. But here is the question most people never ask themselves. How long will you deny what you already know to avoid the discomfort of change? The Stoics understood that personal evolution creates necessary distance. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the loneliness of the philosopher king, surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone in his commitment to virtue and reason. Seneca observed that as you develop yourself, you will naturally drift away from those who remain stagnant, and that this drift is not a betrayal but a consequence of living according to your nature. Epictetus taught his students that some relationships are meant to be outgrown, that clinging to connections that no longer serve your development is a form of self-sabotage disguised as loyalty. We have been conditioned to believe that loyalty means staying, that growth means bringing everyone with you, that evolving beyond your current circle is somehow cruel or elitist. But the Stoics would call this confusion a failure to distinguish between genuine loyalty and self-destruction. Loyalty to others should never require disloyalty to yourself. Commitment to relationships should never mean abandoning your commitment to growth. There is a profound difference between abandoning people callously and recognizing that you have become incompatible with certain environments, certain conversations, certain ways of being in the world. The concept the Stoics called oikiosis, the natural expansion of concern from self to family to community to humanity, includes within it a lesser discussed corollary. As you expand, some connections will naturally fall away. Not because you have become cold, but because you have become different. You have different concerns now. You value different things. You are interested in different questions. The person who is genuinely committed to virtue, to excellence, to the examined life will eventually find that most people are not. And this realization, when it comes, is both liberating and isolating. Let us be clear about what we mean by weak people, because this phrase can be easily misunderstood. We are not talking about people who struggle. We are not talking about people who fail or suffer or make mistakes. The Stoics had profound compassion for human weakness and error. What we are talking about is something different. People who have made weakness itself their identity, who have chosen to remain in patterns of complaint, victimhood, mediocrity, and moral cowardice not because they cannot change, but because they will not. People who are actively hostile to growth, who mock excellence, who pull others down to justify their own stagnation. Seneca wrote about this type extensively in his letters. He described people who seemed to take pride in their own suffering, who wore their struggles like badges of honor, who resented anyone who suggested they had agency to improve their circumstances. He warned that spending time with such people was dangerous not because they would directly harm you, but because their mindset was contagious. Attitudes spread like disease. If you surround yourself with people who believe they are victims of circumstance, you will slowly begin to think the same way. If you surround yourself with people who mock discipline and ambition, you will find your own commitment weakening. The first hidden sign that you have outgrown weak people is this: their problems no longer interest you. Not because you lack compassion, but because you recognize the difference between genuine problems and chosen drama. There are people who face real difficulties, illness, loss, injustice, tragedy. These deserve compassion and support. But there are also people whose problems are entirely self-created and endlessly repeated. They make the same poor decisions, ignore the same advice, complain about the same circumstances they refuse to change. At some point in your development, You stop engaging with this kind of suffering because you realize it is not suffering at all. It is entertainment, it is identity, it is a way of avoiding responsibility. When you were less developed, you might have found these conversations engaging. You might have offered advice, tried to help, invested emotional energy in solving problems that were never meant to be solved. But as you mature, you begin to see the pattern. The problem is not actually the problem. The problem is that the person has built their entire sense of self around having this problem. They do not want solutions. They want validation. They do not want to change. They want permission to stay the same while complaining about it. And once you see this clearly, you can no longer pretend otherwise. The conversations feel like theater, and you are tired of your assigned role. The second hidden sign is that you have stopped explaining yourself. There was a time when you felt compelled to justify your choices, to explain your priorities, to defend your values to people who did not share them. You wanted their approval or at least their understanding. But something has shifted. You no longer feel that need. Not because you have become arrogant or closed-minded, but because you have become secure in your own judgment. You know why you make the choices you make. You know what you value and why. You do not need external validation to confirm what you have already determined through reflection and experience. The Stoics called this inner authority, the capacity to stand on your own judgment without requiring consensus. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that the opinions of others could not touch his essential self, that external approval or disapproval was neither good nor bad, that his duty was to his own reason and conscience, not to the court of public opinion. This was not isolation or arrogance. This was sovereignty. He knew that most people would not understand his choices because most people had not done the work of examining their lives. Their confusion or criticism was not evidence that he was wrong. It was evidence that they were operating from different premises. When weak people encounter someone who has developed this inner authority, they often react with hostility or dismissal. They will call you cold, arrogant, changed, not yourself anymore. They will say you think you are better than everyone else. And here is the uncomfortable truth. In a sense, you do think you are better, not better as a human being, not more valuable, not more deserving of dignity, but better at managing your mind, better at governing your choices, better at living according to principles rather than impulses. This is not arrogance if it is true. It is simply accurate self-assessment. The person who has spent years training their mind is objectively better at using it than the person who has not. The person who has developed discipline is objectively more disciplined than the person who lives by whim. The third hidden sign is that you have become comfortable with solitude. Not isolation, which is forced and painful, but solitude, which is chosen and restorative. There was a time when being alone felt like failure, when you needed constant social contact to feel validated, when an empty calendar caused anxiety. But as you have grown, you have discovered something the Stoics knew intimately. The best company is often your own. Not because other people are worthless, but because most social interaction is performance, distraction, or obligation rather than genuine connection. Seneca wrote extensively about the value of solitude for the developing mind. He argued that the person who cannot be alone with themselves reveals that they have nothing inside worth knowing. If your own thoughts bore you, if your own company feels unbearable, that is not evidence you need more social activity. It is evidence you need more internal development. The wise person, the person committed to growth, finds solitude not merely tolerable but necessary. It is in solitude that you think clearly, that you examine your principles, that you rebuild the parts of yourself that daily life erodes. Weak people are terrified of solitude because solitude forces confrontation with the self. When there are no distractions, no social performances, no external drama to focus on, They are left with their own minds, and they do not like what they find there. So they fill every moment with noise, television, social media, shallow friendships, constant plans. They call this being social or staying connected, but the Stoic recognizes it as avoidance. They are fleeing themselves, and no amount of social activity will help because they bring themselves to every interaction. As you outgrow weak people, you find yourself choosing solitude more frequently. Not because you dislike people, but because you have discovered that shallow connection is more exhausting than being alone. A conversation that goes nowhere, that touches nothing real, that circles endlessly around trivial concerns. This drains you in a way that solitude never does. You would rather be alone with a book, with your thoughts, with silence, than suffer through another interaction that pretends to be connection but is really just mutual distraction. This shift changes how you approach relationships entirely. You stop maintaining friendships out of obligation or history. You stop accepting invitations to events that do not interest you just to avoid feeling left out. You stop pretending to care about conversations that bore you. This is not cruelty. This is honesty. You have limited time and limited energy, and you have decided to spend both on what actually matters to you rather than on performing social obligations that serve no purpose beyond maintaining appearances. The fourth hidden sign is that you have stopped seeking permission. Weak people are constantly looking for validation before they act. They need to know that others approve of their choices, that their decisions are normal, that they are not stepping too far outside acceptable boundaries. They conduct their lives by committee, always checking whether their thoughts and actions conform to group consensus. This is a form of cowardice disguised as consideration, and once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. The Stoic does not seek permission because the Stoic recognizes that most people have not examined their lives, have not questioned their assumptions, have not developed coherent principles to live by. Why would you seek approval from people who are operating on autopilot? Why would you ask permission from people who have never questioned what they believe or why they believe it? The crowd is not wise. The crowd is comfortable. The crowd mistakes familiarity for truth and tradition for wisdom. If you wait for the crowd's permission to live according to your values, you will wait forever. Epictetus taught that the free person is the one who has internalized correct judgment and no longer requires external validation. He told his students that as long as you are checking whether others approve of you, you are still enslaved. True freedom begins when you stop asking and start deciding. This does not mean becoming reckless or ignoring all counsel. It means developing your own judgment to the point where you trust it more than you trust popular opinion. It means being willing to be wrong on your own terms rather than right according to someone else's standards. When you reach this point, weak people become uncomfortable around you. Your lack of need for their approval threatens them because it reveals their own dependence on external validation. If you can live without needing constant affirmation, what does that say about them? If you can make difficult choices without pulling the group, what excuse do they have for their own indecision? Your independence is a mirror showing them their dependence, and they resent you for it. They will call you stubborn, difficult, unwilling to listen. What they mean is that you are unwilling to obey. The fifth hidden sign is that you have become intolerant of mediocrity. Not in others necessarily, but definitely in yourself. There was a time when good enough was acceptable, when you could coast on natural ability or minimal effort, when you did not push yourself because pushing was uncomfortable. But something has changed. You have tasted what it feels like to operate at a higher level, to push beyond your comfortable limits, to demand more from yourself than anyone else demands from you. And now you cannot go back. Mediocrity has become intolerable not because you are judging others, but because you know what you are capable of and you refuse to settle for less. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this internal standard constantly. He did not compare himself to other emperors or to other men. He compared himself to what virtue required, to what his nature as a rational being demanded, to what he knew he was capable of when he operated at his best. This standard was exhausting because it never let him rest, never let him justify poor effort with the excuse that he was better than most people. Better than most was irrelevant. The question was whether he was living up to his own potential, and the answer was almost always no, which meant there was always more work to do. This intolerance for mediocrity creates distance from weak people because weak people have made peace with their own mediocrity. They have lowered their standards to match their effort rather than raising their effort to match their potential. They are comfortable being average, and your discomfort with your own averageness threatens that comfort. When you are constantly trying to improve, constantly pushing yourself, constantly refusing to accept your current level as your final level, you implicitly challenge everyone around you to do the same. Most people do not want that challenge. They want permission to stay where they are, and your refusal to give yourself that permission feels like judgment even when it is not. The sixth and final hidden sign is that you have developed what the Stoics called philanthropia, a genuine love for humanity that is compatible with dislike of most individual humans. This sounds paradoxical until you understand what it means. The Stoic loves humanity in the abstract, values all rational beings as part of a cosmic whole, recognizes the inherent worth of every person. But the Stoic is also ruthlessly honest about individual character. Most people are not living according to reason. Most people are controlled by passion, fear, and opinion. Most people are capable of better but are choosing worse. The Stoic can love humanity while being profoundly disappointed in most humans. Marcus Aurelius embodied this tension perfectly. He wrote about waking each day and knowing he would encounter people who were selfish, ungrateful, violent, and deceitful. He did not pretend otherwise. He did not try to find the good in everyone or convince himself that people were better than they were. He saw them clearly, but he also recognized that they were his kin, that they shared his rational nature even if they did not exercise it, that their errors came from ignorance rather than malice. This allowed him to maintain compassion without requiring proximity, to value humans without needing to spend time with them. When you reach this level of development, you stop feeling guilty about your selectivity with people. You understand that choosing to limit your exposure to certain individuals is not a failure of compassion. It is a recognition of reality. You cannot save people from themselves. You cannot force growth on someone who is not ready. You cannot make someone value what they do not value. All you can do is protect your own development by curating your environment carefully, by choosing to spend time with people who elevate rather than diminish you, by refusing to sacrifice your growth on the altar of inclusion. Weak people will call this elitism. They will accuse you of thinking you are too good for them. And in a sense, they are correct. You have become too good for certain environments, certain conversations, certain patterns of interaction. Not too good as a human being, but too developed for undeveloped spaces. The person who has stopped drinking cannot spend time in bars without temptation. The person who has developed discipline cannot surround themselves with chaos without erosion. The person who values truth cannot engage constantly with people who prefer comfortable lies. This is not snobbery. This is self-preservation. Seneca wrote about this in his letters, warning his friend to be careful about who he spent time with because character is contagious. He observed that you become like the people you surround yourself with, that their habits seep into you, that their standards become your standards unless you actively resist. This is not theoretical. Modern psychology has extensively validated this ancient wisdom. Your peer group shapes your behavior more than almost any other factor. If your friends are undisciplined, you will become more undisciplined. If your associates are content with mediocrity, you will drift toward mediocrity. If the people around you mock ambition and excellence, you will find your own ambition weakening. This means that outgrowing weak people is not optional if you are serious about your own development. It is necessary. You cannot maintain high standards while immersed in low-standard environments. You cannot practice virtue while surrounded by people who mock it. You cannot build discipline while spending time with people who celebrate its absence. At some point, you must choose. Stay comfortable with people who are not growing, or embrace the loneliness that comes with growth. Most people choose comfort. They choose to stay. They choose to dim their own light so others do not feel threatened by it. The Stoic makes the other choice. But this choice comes with costs that must be acknowledged honestly. When you outgrow your current circle and do not immediately find a new one, there is a period of isolation that can be painful. You are no longer at home in your old environment, but you have not yet found your new tribe. You are between worlds, and this liminal space is uncomfortable. Old friends feel distant. New friends have not yet appeared. You are alone with your development, and there are moments when you question whether the trade was worth it. Moments when you wonder if you were wrong to outgrow people who, despite their limitations, cared about you. The Stoic response to this doubt is not to deny the pain, but to reframe it. Loneliness is the price of growth, and growth is the price of living according to your nature. You can choose the pain of loneliness, which is temporary and accompanied by development, or the pain of stagnation, which is permanent and accompanied by regret. Both paths involve suffering. The question is which suffering serves your ultimate purpose. Marcus Aurelius chose loneliness. Seneca chose loneliness. Epictetus chose loneliness, not because they were misanthropes, but because they recognized that genuine connection with most people was impossible once you had committed to living examined lives. This does not mean you will be alone forever. As you continue to develop, you will eventually find others on similar paths. But these connections are rare and must be discovered rather than forced. You cannot make people value what you value. You cannot argue someone into caring about growth. You can only live according to your principles and trust that, over time, you will attract people who share those principles. The Stoics called these people fellow travelers or members of the same universal city, people committed to reason, virtue, and self-examination regardless of their particular circumstances or culture. Until you find these fellow travelers, you must become comfortable being your own companion. This requires developing a rich internal life, philosophical study, reflective practice, creative work, purposeful solitude. The person who needs constant external stimulation will collapse in loneliness. The person who has built a fortress of internal resources will find loneliness merely inconvenient rather than unbearable. You must become the kind of person who can sustain themselves mentally, emotionally, and philosophically without requiring constant input from others. This self-sufficiency is what the Stoics called autarkia, self-mastery in the fullest sense. Not just control over your reactions, but genuine independence from external circumstances, including social circumstances. The person who has achieved this can enjoy company when it is available and meaningful, but does not collapse when it is not. They can engage deeply with others who are worth engaging with, but can withdraw without guilt when the environment becomes toxic or trivial. They are free in a way that most people never experience because most people are enslaved to their need for social acceptance. Let us return to each of these 6 signs and examine what they reveal about your development and what they demand from you going forward. The first sign, that their problems no longer interest you, reveals that you have developed discernment between genuine suffering and chosen drama. This is a crucial skill because compassion without discernment leads to enabling dysfunction. The appropriate response here is not to become cold or dismissive of all suffering, but to become strategic about where you invest your emotional energy. Reserve your compassion for those who are genuinely struggling and genuinely trying. Withdraw it from those who are performing struggle as a form of identity or manipulation. The second sign, that you have stopped explaining yourself, reveals that you have developed internal authority and no longer require external validation for your choices. This is liberation, but it also requires vigilance. The temptation will be to swing too far in the opposite direction, to become so independent that you refuse all counsel and feedback. The wise person remains open to legitimate criticism while becoming immune to illegitimate judgment. They can distinguish between feedback from someone who understands what they are trying to accomplish and criticism from someone who does not share their values. Learn to listen to the former while ignoring the latter. The third sign, that you have become comfortable with solitude, reveals that you have built sufficient internal resources to sustain yourself without constant external stimulation. This is essential for any serious intellectual or creative work, but monitor yourself for the tendency to use solitude as avoidance rather than restoration. There is a difference between productive solitude where you think, create, and reflect, and escapist isolation where you hide from challenges. The Stoic embraces the former and guards against the latter. Solitude should make you stronger for engagement, not weaker at it. The fourth sign, that you have stopped seeking permission, reveals that you have internalized your own judgment and trust it more than popular opinion. This is necessary for living an examined life because the examined life almost always deviates from conventional wisdom. But this independence must be accompanied by humility about your own fallibility. You can trust your judgment without believing it is infallible. You can live by your principles without assuming those principles are beyond examination. The free person is free from needing others' approval, but not free from questioning their own assumptions. The fifth sign, that you have become intolerant of mediocrity in yourself, reveals that you have tasted excellence and can no longer settle for less. This internal standard is what separates people who grow continuously from people who plateau early. But be careful that this intolerance does not become perfectionism that paralyzes you. The Stoic standard is excellence of effort, not perfection of outcome. You cannot control results, only your commitment to doing your best. As long as you are genuinely pushing yourself, genuinely refusing to coast, genuinely demanding more from yourself than others demand, you are meeting the standard. The outcome is up to fate. The sixth sign, that you have developed love for humanity compatible with selectivity about individual humans, reveals that you have achieved the Stoic balance between universal benevolence and particular discernment. You value all humans as rational beings while recognizing that most are not exercising that rationality. This allows you to maintain compassion without requiring proximity, to wish people well without needing to spend time with them. The practical application is this: be kind to everyone, but be close to few. Offer goodwill universally, offer intimacy selectively. If you recognize these 6 signs in yourself, you are already in the process of outgrowing weak people. The question is what you will do with this recognition. Will you feel guilty and try to shrink yourself back down to fit your old environment? Will you pretend you have not changed to avoid making others uncomfortable? Will you sacrifice your growth to maintain relationships that no longer serve you? Most people make these compromises. They dim their light. They lower their standards. They betray their own development to maintain social comfort. The Stoic refuses these compromises. But refusal must be accompanied by wisdom about how to navigate the transition. You do not need to announce that you have outgrown people or explain to them why you are creating distance. You do not need to burn bridges or create unnecessary conflict. You simply become less available. You decline invitations more often. You let conversations naturally drift apart. You stop initiating contact with people who drain you. Most of these relationships will fade quietly without drama. Some will provoke confrontation from people who notice the distance and demand explanation. When this happens, you must decide whether explanation serves any purpose or simply creates more conflict. In most cases, explanation serves no purpose. People who have not done the work of self-examination cannot understand the motivations of people who have. They will interpret your growth as betrayal, your standards as judgment, your distance as cruelty. No explanation you offer will satisfy them because the real issue is not what you say but who you have become. You have become someone they do not recognize, someone who no longer fits the role they assigned you, someone who threatens their comfort by demonstrating that growth is possible. They do not want explanation. They want you to return to who you were. And that is the one thing you cannot give them. The path forward is clear but not easy. Continue your development without apology. Protect your solitude. Maintain your standards. Trust your judgment. Be selective about who you spend time with. Accept that this will create distance from people you once felt close to. Accept that this distance will sometimes hurt, will sometimes feel like loss, will sometimes make you question whether you are wrong. The Stoic response to this doubt is not to eliminate it but to examine it rationally. Ask yourself, am I growing or shrinking? Am I becoming more myself or less? Am I moving toward my values or away from them? If the answers indicate growth, alignment, and authenticity, then the discomfort of distance is the cost you must pay, and it is worth paying. Over time, as you continue on this path, you will find that new connections form naturally with people who are on similar journeys. These relationships will be different from your old ones, deeper in some ways, more challenging, more honest, less comfortable but more rewarding. You will not need as many of them because quality replaces quantity. A single conversation with someone who understands what you are trying to do is worth more than a dozen shallow interactions with people who do not. These are the fellow travelers the Stoics wrote about, rare, valuable, worth seeking but impossible to force. Until you find them, practice being your own best companion. Build your internal resources. Study philosophy not as academic exercise but as practical wisdom for living. Develop your craft, whatever it is. Train your body. Refine your mind. Examine your principles. When you do this work consistently, you become the kind of person that other developed people are attracted to. You become a magnet for excellence rather than mediocrity. But this only happens if you refuse to compromise your standards to maintain connections that no longer serve your growth. The 6 hidden signs that you have outgrown weak people are not cause for celebration or guilt. They are simply markers on a journey that everyone who commits to growth will eventually traverse. Some people reach these markers early. Some reach them late. Some never reach them at all because they choose comfort over development at every decision point. Where you are on this journey matters less than whether you are moving forward or staying still. If you recognize these signs in yourself, you are moving forward. The question is whether you will have the courage to keep moving even when the path ahead is lonely and the path behind is comfortable. If you are ready to walk this path without apology, to embrace the loneliness that comes with growth, to trust that your development matters more than others' comfort, then continue this journey with us. Subscribe to Beyond the Logos, and together we will practice the ancient art of living according to principle rather than popular opinion. The weak will not understand. The strong will need no explanation. Walk the path anyway.